Okay, hi, I'm Dána-Ain Davis. I am a professor of anthropology at the Graduate Center, City University of New York. I'm also the director for the Center for the Study of Women in Society at the Graduate Center, and professor of urban studies at Queens College.
Well, thank you for joining us today. We're going to be talking about your book, Reproductive Injustice, Racism, Pregnancy, and Premature Birth.
Yes.
Which I would love you to begin by telling us what brought you to prematurity and birth and to write this book.
So initially, I was interested in writing a book that looked at the history of neonatal intensive care units. I was interested in their proliferation. I was interested in why states were spending so much money to enhance them. And I gave a talk about neonatal intensive care units and incubators in particular in the state of Illinois. And after I gave that talk, a young woman came up to me and asked me if she could talk to me about her experience with her premature birth. And as a result of that request from her, which rarely happens, that anthropologists get people to say, "Oh, I'd like to tell you something," I kind of changed the nature of my research and moved toward understanding what the experience of premature birth was like, and understanding how people felt about the neonatal intensive care unit, and ultimately the way that race and racism factored into people's experiences.
Yeah, and the book does a great job of of overlaying all of that on top of both a historical analysis and a contemporary analysis. And the thing that I would like to begin with a statement that you have in the book, which is this: there has never been a time when Black women's reproduction was treated respectfully in the United States.
That is absolutely true. There has never been a time, and that is in part, and not in part, but predominantly because Black women's reproduction has been the content and the foundation of racial capitalism. So there has been no sort of policy or concern about Black women's reproduction in terms of personal desire, but rather in terms of control, which is something that Jennifer Morgan has talked about, and Dorothy Roberts has talked about. Black women's bodies are used as fodder for the capitalist society upon which the United States has been built.
And if we could talk a little bit more about how that began and how it manifests itself today. That's a big question. We could probably talk the rest of the time just about that. But just kind of a thumbnail overview.
I mean, the beginnings of of what we understand as the colonies and the beginnings of America are rooted in the practices of enslavement. And even prior to the quote end of slavery, there were reductions in there were shifts in the ability to bring enslaved people to the United States, but there has always been a way in which the reproduction of the group of people who provided free labor in the United States has been or has shaped the content of this country. And so, reproduction happens in two ways. There's biological reproduction and social reproduction. And in order for an entity and a place to continue its growth and its sustenance, it requires a population of humans. And in the case of America, it required the development and the reproduction of other human beings. So Black women's bodies have been in the United States reproducing bodies, those bodies which make the people that are needed for labor. At the same time, those bodies are reviled for historically being considered hypersexual, and contributing, as I said, to racial capitalism.
Well, and I think that is such an important point, and drawing that into the present with Black motherhood and how some of these, what you call the afterlife of slavery in the book, creates this developing idea of Black motherhood, not only in contrast of white motherhood and white male fatherhood and all that family dynamic, but there's also the idea, and we'll get to how, what I'm trying to get at is how Black motherhood is held culpable for health disparity and health outcome of birthing and pregnancy.
So, Black motherhood in many ways in the United States has historically existed for the purpose of this reproduction, right? This process of reproduction, this practice. I think in the book, I might refer to the way in which Black women are viewed as monstrous mothers. And that depiction of Black women also aligns with the idea, some of the other ideas that circulate about Black women, which have to do with hypersexuality, being angry. There's a consistent pattern of denigration of Black women, and in particular, in Black people more generally, that manifests itself in all of the ways in which basically the dominant population in the United States views white women in more positive terms. And so the impact of the monstrous Black woman or Black mother, the impact of the negative and stereotypical ideas about Black womanhood and Black motherhood can in many ways be viewed as having accrued through a series of policies, programs, and practices that shape how Black people and women and mothers are presented to society. This idea of sort of monstrous mothers has many trajectories, one of which we see in the work of Daniel Patrick Moynihan and his report, The Negro Family, where the blame of some of the issues, social problems in the United States were placed at the foot and the body of Black women for being, quote, single parents, for raising, sort of recalcitrant people. So there are multiple ways in which Black womanhood and Black motherhood constantly thread a needle of degradation. And it serves a purpose to keep people in place, to control people, to control Black bodies, to talk about ways in which Black bodies need to be restricted and restrained, which has led to things like sterilization, led to things like incarceration, led to things like the utilization of various forms of birth control to address what people perceive as social problems that find a resolution in the body of a Black person, a Black mother.
Yeah, and that's such a great point, because in the book you say specifically that racism is constantly recalibrated, and that these ideologies begin in slavery, and this is what we're talking about, and are just reproduced over and over and over again. and just keep reappearing whenever there's a new move forward or any.
Yeah, I mean, it's yes, there might be ways in which we could look at notions of progress, etc. But I think what I was really trying to get at with that statement is that the manifestations of racism adjust themselves to whatever the contemporary circumstances are. And they show up. How do they show up in the case of my work? It shows up in the way in which Black women are more likely than white women to die, more likely than white women to have children born prematurely, more likely to experience morbidity, more likely to experience mortality, more likely. And so, whereas at one point, maybe the content and the texture and the experience of racism could, for example, look like, lynching. Racism is always willing to recalibrate itself in its own interests and in the interest of really capitalism and in the interest of control. And I think that's most profoundly explicated in Dorothy Roberts' book, Killing the Black Body. And that recalibration comes in the form of, as I said, policy, program, practices. It comes in the form of technology. It comes in the form of sets of ideas, right? It comes in the form of, like, racism gets recalibrated in the form of the development of the prison industrial complex. So that's really what I was trying to get at.
And thank you for clarifying that, because I think one of the most obvious questions is, why do you think Black women are constantly the more likely?
The why, I think, rests with the answer is, I think, racism. I think that racism permeates so much of our society. I think that we tend to be a little myopic in our understanding of racism, that it happens predominantly in the United States, but some of these patterns of controlling race, of controlling reproduction, in particular, we see going back to the time of the development of the Cape Colony in South Africa. We see the control of reproducing bodies, really for the purposes of benefiting the wealth of King Leopold in the Belgian Congo, where they tried to control the breastfeeding of Congolese women, whose breastfeeding patterns disrupted reproduction, which was needed to create a labor force. So the answer is racism. A question might be, what form does that take in different places and at different times? In the United States, I think it has taken all manner of forms, with the reduction of midwives, who were, by the way, a labor force. It comes in the form of technology that's used to save babies, but that technology doesn't necessarily work the same for all infants. So, yeah, the answer is racism. The question is both why, how, and how to end it.
Well, yeah, let's bring it into medical racism of today and the NICUs and premature babies, because some of the most moving parts of your books are these stories of women who birth stories, of women who had, for various reasons. And I'd like to talk about the various reasons why women have premature babies, but why Black women tend to have more premature babies.
So there are a number of theories about why Black women have premature infants. One of them is the weathering hypothesis, which suggests that Black women experience really sort of physiological breakdowns, almost at birth, but not quite, but that the impact of racism has a sort of physiological effect. That's one reason that people provide. Another has to do with the structures of society that just that create an unevenness in the access to resources, but also an unevenness in the quality of resources. So I've recently been talking about uneven reproduction, which is not only that something negative happens to Black women, but that it happens to Black women at the exact same time that there are positive access points and entry points and supports for white women. That's what creates, I think, an unevenness. And it can come in the form of an infusion of capital into the development, say, of hospital situations. It can come in the form of policies, practices, and procedures, my 3 Ps, or the 3 Ps. And so the unevenness, I think, is what perpetuates and creates this circumstance. There's also the issue, for example, of environmental factors. Where is it that people live? Sometimes that has something to do with it. Sometimes it might be what Leith Mullings and Alaka Wali talk about in their book, Stress and Resilience, is the combination of being stressed by racism and the resilience of trying to attack racism. That those things in combination create a scenario in which people discursively end up both fighting against and fighting for structures that harm, and that contributes or can contribute to, for example, to premature babies or low birth weight babies. I would also say that we cannot overlook the role of medical systems. I think, well, I don't think medical entities, are able to engage in a lot of practices that support certain kinds of outcomes. One thing, for example, we know is that assuming that there are no other health issues, a midwifery model of care has the most positive outcome or often has a positive outcome for Black women, for Indigenous women, for Latinx women. But the model of care that dominates our society is a medical model of care, is an interventionist model of it's not even care, of service, one that is not necessarily collaborative, one that relies on expertise of physicians who enter into their fields often with very negative ideas about particular groups of people. And I am hard pressed to say that those ideas don't leak into the way that they treat people, along with the fact that certain groups of people, that Black women, are more likely to be the recipients of major forms of intervention because they're already viewed a priori as being problem, being at risk, having risky both behaviors, risky health profiles.
And then, but then that exhaustion kicks in too, because while they're seen as being risky and problematic and potentially higher prone to various things, they're also dismissed. And they're talking about their own bodies is not valued by the white male doctor, let's say. And so some of this is that exhaustion you were talking about, where we're saying we're colorblind, but we're also perpetuating a negative stereotype and then dismissing you when you act against it.
It's a sort of cyclical, it's a discursive situation that sort of replicates itself time and again. I think the stories in the book, the narratives, that they're birth stories, which is a form of like life history, are entry points, which I hope serve as a point also of empathy and a point of entry for change. Now, one of the things that I hear frequently, or that I'm asked frequently, is, don't these negative things that happen to Black women happen to other people, other birthing people? And the answer is yes. And there is, in fact, a rise in some of the adverse birth outcomes, for example, among white women. That is true. What is also true is the difference is that I don't know of any white woman who thinks that the reason for the outcome has to do with their race or their ethnicity. And I am not suggesting that all Black women do think that it is because of that, but Black women do think that race or racism has something, that racism has a lot to do with the way they are treated. And some of that comes with medical training. It emerges from a medical training perspective. If you take a look at almost any OBGYN textbook, I don't have a most recent copy, but I do have a copy. They're thick, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages with lots and lots and lots of illustrations. And in one book that I have, of all of those hundreds of illustrations, there are only 3 of ambiguously non-white humans, people, women. And those 3 all rest in a sort of category of risk and problems. So one is connected to STIs, another is connected to the other 2 are connected to risky issues and risky gynecological issues. Well, if that's the entree into learning about the discipline, then people are already predisposed to, and this would go for any medical professional, they're already predisposed to assuming that the Black body is, or a brown body has deficits.
Well, and I'm glad you brought up the gynecological textbooks, because without the Black body, there would be no OBGYN. I mean, it was developed on slave women.
The field of obstetrics and gynecology arise in 2 spaces. In the United States, yes, people have written about the rise of obstetrics and gynecology and the experimentation that takes place on enslaved women. According to Deirdre Cooper Owens, those people would be identified, or should be identified, as the mothers of gynecology. But I also want to point out that the other important factor in understanding the rise of gynecology also has to do with ensuring that white women's children survive and that white women survive, which in many instances one could track toward a logic of eugenics. And so, if the whole point is to help a particular group of people to survive at the expense of experimenting on another group of people that the society doesn't really care about, then we move into a different kind of logic about what gynecology and obstetrics both could have been, and in fact, in some instances, what it was.
Well, and I think it also speaks to the continuance of that eugenic racial policy program, I should say, because if one would ask the question, what does white supremacy have to gain from the destruction of Black bodies and the failure of birth and making it to the first year of life? It's exactly that, the sustaining of an ideology that completely dismisses and categorizes and criminalizes brown bodies.
And that's exactly what this framework of uneven reproduction that I've recently been talking about expresses. If obstetrics and gynecology can be deployed against Black women, but for white women, then that is uneven reproduction, and it swims in the same sort of pool, if you will, of eugenic ideology. It can. I'm not suggesting that all gynecologists and obstetricians are eugenic, or that even in the past that they were, but it's a short walk. It could be a short walk.
Well, and it's also part of the ideology of white supremacy, so you can't deny the eugenics.
Exactly.
Okay.
So, absolutely.
Right. So just to kind of not end on a completely terrible note, I would like to talk about this, you end the book on radical Black birth workers. And I'd love for you to tell us who they are, what some of them do, and how they're challenging this diagnostic racist system that we've just been outlining.
So I refer to radical Black birth workers as the group of people who have really provided support to Black women so that they could have successful birth outcomes. And in that group, I include then and I include now midwives, doulas, birth support people, reproductive justice advocates, and quite frankly, I would include those obstetricians and gynecologists and physicians who are also really very committed to enhancing or actually creating a frame for justice in the reproduction process. In addition, though, to those people who are radical birth workers, they are, and I want to say this in particular about doulas, who, on the one hand, on a policy level, people believe that doulas are going to fix everything because outcomes are known to be better with doula support. On the other hand, people also view doulas as being at the sort of lower end of the scale in terms of the labor scale. On the other hand, I want to point out that most doulas that I know are not sort of politically immune to the other ways in which they could be organizing, both with other doulas, with midwives, and in other movements, to really shift some of the many adverse outcomes that exist, not only reproductive, but, food injustice, housing injustice. In other words, what I'm saying is that these radical birth workers, I perceive them as radical and call them that because they do have a comprehensive political analysis that is about biological reproduction, physiological reproduction, and social reproduction. They understand and explore, for example, the politics of being able to get infant formula. They understand the link between, often the link between how Black women are treated in the United States as they are in other countries. I also would like to point out that a lot of the work that I have done has focused on this thing that I call obstetric racism. which is not named in the book, but the foundation for it exists in the book. And oftentimes people believe that I sort of blame the medical professionals, that I blame doctors and so forth. And I think they're low-hanging fruit. I think that one of the more positive ways in which outcomes could be changed, if we're going to stay within a medical-based model of service, is to consider quality improvement and quality implementation at a hospital level. That's the space where decisions get made about what kind of procedures are going to happen or not going to happen relative to insurance reimbursements, relative to accreditation. And in that regard, those sciences actually need to be fully brought into understanding what are the implications of deciding that a person should have a C-section if their blood pressure is low, but their liver enzymes are high, that kind of thing. And then there's really the way in which the medical profession really does need to pay more attention to these radical birth workers and to people who experience the medical system as a place of harm. And I honestly think that if that doesn't happen, then we're unable to try to shift the tide. It actually, if you think about it, it actually makes no sense that at a moment when we have some of the most advanced technology that can save little teeny babies, little neonates. At the same time, we now have some of the highest rates of mortality since the 1960s. It is absolutely remarkable. And that suggests there needs to be, I think, a rethinking of the medical complex. There needs to be an infusion of resources put toward community-based spaces for reproductive health issues, for reproductive and sexual health issues. That is absolutely paramount. We need more community-based nurses. We need more community-based clinics. We need more community-based health workers. We need more birthing centers. We need more support people for home births. We need reimbursement schemes for all of that. Because I know that hospitals are important, but they cannot continue to control, just think about this. We have one of the highest percentages of maternal mortality and infant mortality in the quote Western world, yet no one can figure out how to pull back the lens so that we can readjust and rethink a model of service that is harming. That's a tremendous problem.
And I don't know, this is just a thought that is tangential. I mean, it comes right out of what you were talking about. And how culpable do you put the insurance industrial complex? And where does that factor in? Because it seems to me that like Medicare can only cover so much of this work. And, private funding can only cover so much of the work. But then we have this insurance structure that is constantly looking at profit.
Right. I mean, the insurance companies are looking at profit, hospitals are looking at profit. And I mean, what we've not tried is universal health care. The only people that get universal health care are people in the armed services and the people in Congress. Like, it's unfathomable that people somehow think that quality care is counterintuitive I mean, I guess they think quality care that might also be low cost is counterintuitive to what makes a good nation state, if you believe in the nation state. And instead, what seems to be the prevailing set of idea is that capitalism needs to replicate itself by constantly oppressing particular groups of people. And so this is where we are, you know. But it's really fascinating that we can't seem to look at any other models that could enhance the health. I mean, and there've been obviously we tried with during Obama's tenure, but I was flummoxed at the idea that people thought that it was a problem. There's this sort of ideology that you have to do something to deserve to live, as opposed to just being alive.
Right. And I think that, if you look at what happened to Obama's plan, it was torpedoed by our great American institution, racism.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so before we fix anything else, we have to fix racism in order to fix everything else.
Well, I actually don't know that we're going to fix racism. I think we might have to fix things just in spite of it, the idea of racism and the practice of racism is rooted in a particular group of people keeping power, and we're not eliminating those people. And so since we're not, does that mean, we can't wait for them to have a change of heart and mind, but rather we need to rethink the systems and the institutions that exist and really demand a kind of change and an engagement with community that can be held accountable, and that can bend to the will of justice, even if it still has some horrible components to it.